Hello, United States History class. This is our review on the Civil War chapter. Going ahead to our PowerPoints here, looking at PowerPoint question number 1, which advantages and disadvantages do you think would be most important for each side in the coming conflict? And a lot of you had excellent answers here. There's really, for a lot of the questions today, there's no real, one right or wrong answer. And a lot of people gave some really good reasons why they thought some of the different advantages or disadvantages were the most important. So I can certainly just go ahead and give you my opinion on this. I would say certainly some of the aspects that loomed large for advantages in the North were certainly going to end up being their population advantage, as one of the problems that the South is eventually going to have is that they really begin running out of troops, and that the way the North is eventually really able to win the war is by taking advantage of just this manpower and the fact that they can engage in battles where they're suffering heavier losses than the Confederacy, but still hold the ground at the end of the day and continue to put pressure on the Confederacy because they simply have so many more soldiers than the South had. You certainly can't underestimate the importance of the industrial advantage either. Just the fact that there was so much more industry going on within the North and the northern portion of the state, manufacturing of the things you'd think about, like arms and ammunition and so forth, but maybe some things you wouldn't think about. Even something as simple as shoes or boots or clothes. One of the big things that ultimately becomes a problem for the South is a lack of food production. Of course, the majority of the agricultural land in the South up until this point in time was, pretty much either one of two factors. It was either, of course, the large plantation systems, or it was much smaller kind of subsistence farming, and a lot of food had to be imported into the South even during, when they were at peace. So now that they're at war, the North had a very large advantage, to support much larger urban industrial centers. The northern states had already kind of begun transitioning to more sort of commercialized farming methods and farming sets, which were ultimately going to allow them, the freedom to feed and support this much larger army that they were going to be able to bring into the field against the Confederate States. The most important disadvantage for the North, I would say early on, would certainly have to be the fact that their generals really were not up to snuff and were really being outgunned and outclassed by the generals of the Confederacy. Although the fact that it took so long to try to kind of get this unified message of what exactly the Union was fighting for, and the fact that there was, even throughout the war, really a lot of dissent from large segments of the population was another disadvantage that the North had to sort of continually deal with. As far as the Confederacy goes, their greatest advantage, I would say, no doubt about it, has to be the generals. Because without Ulysses S. Grant, without Stonewall Jackson, without William Bedford Forrest, without a number of their generals, really the Confederacy would have had absolutely no chance in the war. And the war probably would have been over relatively quickly, given all those advantages that the North had. The only thing, and the one way that the South was able to really combat a lot of these advantages that the North had just sort of in numbers, was the quality of the leadership on the battlefield. And that's shown through very early, of course, in the first couple of years of the conflict. Biggest disadvantages of the South, surprisingly, I would probably have to say the fact that as time goes on, this entire ideology of really strong states' rights that they had sort of formed this rebellion around. Of course, it was states' rights, particularly to defend the institution of slavery, but even still, it made it very difficult for the South to ever form a government that was strong enough to operate in wartime, and that a lot of times the states wanted to kind of do their own thing during the war. They didn't provide enough support, or the support that they said they were going to the federal government, and that sort of that entire ideology of really strong independent states ends up hurting the Confederacy once they actually do form their own country and do enter into the war. But certainly just the numerous other advantages that the North sort of inherently had, manpower, food supply, industrialization, all the things we were talking about certainly went in to impacting this as well. PowerPoint question number 2, once more, really hard to pick one right or correct answer here. Battle of Antietam, Vicksburg, or Gettysburg. All places where momentum kind of swung to the Union. Which battle do you think was most important and why? And a lot of people had very good answers for all of them. Battle of Antietam, incredibly important. This is kind of one of the first real victories that the Union had, just kind of showing that they were actually capable of winning against General Lee, the Confederacy, even though it could have been a much greater victory, and it was sort of just enough for Lincoln to grab on that momentum, issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and really kind of change the war in a couple of fundamental ways. Vicksburg, of course, very important as well, because after another kind of long stretch of Confederate victories, this was the biggest victory in the West and really completed cutting the Confederacy in two. And from a strategic standpoint, it was very difficult to, once kind of the Texas and Arkansas and some of the western states were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, very difficult to see how they were going to be able to kind of come back and fight against this, and really hurt their ability to continue the war as a unified group, with the Union pretty much cutting all the way down the Mississippi. And of course, Gettysburg, the very fact that Lee and his army lost so many men in the battle through Pickett's charge, and the fact that that was really the high water mark of the Confederacy, and they never were able to get to that point again. They were going to go on, win a few more battles, but generally from that point forward, it was a slow retreat, particularly after Ulysses S. Grant is able to come in, take over the Army of the Potomac, and really kind of begin engaging in a kind of warfare that was pretty much going to be impossible for the South to succeed in and to win against. So yeah, once more, I could see the arguments that were being made for all three, and I thought you all did a very good job articulating why you thought those were the most important, but really hard to kind of key on one clear or right answer. So what cultural factors do you believe helped lead to the transition towards modern warfare? I think there's a couple of main things you can look at here. The first, of course, has to be technology. Technology, and not just the weapons on the battlefield itself, but the different way that people were now kind of living, and the impacts that had on war. Like I said, much more than just the technology used in the war itself, but the fact that you could now supply a much larger army in the field than you ever could before for a much longer time period than you could before. Going back to when I was talking about kind of the industrialization of farming and farming methods, of uniform creation, of all these weapons. Just the industrialized process meant that armies from this time period going forward could be much larger and sustained for a longer period of time than they could have been in the past. Also, if you want to look at the transition towards things like total war, now that through the process of industrialization, kind of an entire country or an entire nation could kind of be seen as supporting a war effort in a way that kind of pre-industrialization, they might not have. Certainly there would have been some aspects of society that could have been contributing to it. But once it's warfare is now being reliant upon kind of the industrialized system, targeting those industrial processes and the people who are working in them sort of becomes a acceptable target in war. And it's no surprise that really starting with kind of Sherman and his march and going into, of course, warfare in the 20th century, you start seeing a greater and greater targeting of civilians on a larger and larger scale, because it is seen that through the industrial process, civilians are kind of the backbone of the military structure, and they are really the ones supporting the military. And if you can take out kind of those supplies in the form of the support that they are getting from kind of these industrialized countries, it makes warfare almost impossible. So that's why it's kind of seen, not that this is a good thing, but is seen more acceptable in warfare moving forward to target civilian populations that are the ones supplying these in much larger armies in the field, with weapons, with food, with supplies, with soldiers, and so forth. Which is why you start seeing that becoming a much greater emphasis of war going into, for example, World War I, the Second World War, and a lot of other examples as well. You can kind of start seeing the beginnings of that here in the Civil War. The other big aspect I would look at would be nationalism. And this kind of goes hand in hand with industrialization as well. Um, but just the way that people were really kind of invested in warfare from this time period moving forward. Very much different than if you think about warfare, for example, in the medieval time period or in the ancient time period, where the armies would oftentimes belong to like nobles or kings or lords, and of course the soldiers would be loyal to their commanders, whether they were a king or whether they were a lord. But the basic, everyday civilian population were usually much more loyal to kind of their immediate surroundings, to their town. They're kind of part of a larger district or province to that, not necessarily to this idea of a kind of larger nation state. That is really what begins forming to a much greater degree in the 19th and moving into the 20th century. And once more kind of signifies kind of the changing world that we're looking at. And industrialization really had a process in that too. But really, if you look at like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, these were kind of the beginnings of this idea of nationalism, right? That all the people within a country should kind of have this patriotic loyalty to that country and should try to help that country in kind of any way, shape, or form they can. When it comes to conflicts with kind of these other nations out there. Certainly wasn't the first time you saw that, but to that scale and to the degree that eventually became, and eventually, of course, all the European nations start kind of emulating this. And you can look at a lot of the wars of unification which take place in Europe, whether it's with Germany and Bismarck, whether it's Italy, and so forth, and see that this is now having a large effect around the world and around the globe. And this really kind of lends itself to this idea of modern warfare as well. So I would say those are kind of the two biggest points you have to look at: the way that industrialization changed the relationship between civilians and war, and just the fact that war was able to become much larger in scale, in size, and of course what goes along with that, and what you kind of saw in some of the earlier slides, is that goes hand in hand, of course, with much heavier casualties. The fact that kind of the killing potential and killing power is becoming much greater. You need a much larger supply of men, of resources to keep these kind of very catastrophic wars going, and that's why wars such as the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War end up having such incredibly high casualty counts and casualty rates, is because this transition towards what we would think of today as kind of a modern style of warfare. So what do you believe are the most important factors in the Union's victory? And this, of course, really ties in really directly to the first question, right? Looking at the advantages that the North had, you can certainly kind of go down the list and say how all of those kind of helped contribute towards the Union's victory. But I guess just once more, not that this is necessarily the right answer, but just my opinion of the matter would be that Lee failing at Gettysburg and suffering higher losses than really the Confederate Army could have sustained, combined with the fact that shortly after that, General Grant was put in charge of the Union Army, and that he was really able to take advantage of the North's advantages and utilize them correctly in a way that his predecessors had not, where he was able to continue just keep putting up and applying pressure to the enemy. And even if he was suffering very high casualty rates, he wouldn't call for withdrawal, or he wouldn't call for a retreat. He'd keep sending the army forward, and even if his army suffered 2-to-1 casualties, he would still hold the ground at the end of the day. Lee and his army would have to retreat. And just this kind of constant pressure that Grant was able to apply to the Confederacy is what ultimately wore them down to the point where they could no longer continue the war. Of course, this goes hand in hand with General Sherman applying kind of this total war strategy of really just kind of decimating the countryside and really trying to target and take out the South's ability to continue and sustain the war, demoralize them. Once more, this gets back to the last question, right? How warfare was changing and the kind of acceptability of targeting civilian targets and property in this process. It all goes hand in hand, and the fact that just the deck was stacked to begin with against the Confederacy, and the fact that Grant and Sherman were sort of able to take advantage of those sort of inherent benefits that they had and use them in the right way really led to the collapse of the Confederacy. So moving on to PowerPoint question number 5. Some historians have suggested that the American Civil War can be seen as a national war of unification, similar to the wars of unification in Germany and Italy. Why might some view the war as a war of unification, and why might some historians disagree? So I know this is kind of a complicated question, and I think some of you had a little trouble kind of grasping what I was looking at here, and that's fine. You know, as long as you tried to answer the question, you were still getting credit for it. You know, really, it's easy to look at the Civil War as kind of this great event that tore the country apart, right? And look at the war at just kind of the face value, that it was all about the division of the United States. But if you look at sort of the long term and you look at the country, let's say 10 years before the Civil War and 10 years after the Civil War, 10 years after the Civil War, the United States was a much more unified country than it was the 10 years before the Civil War. The fact that there was this kind of lingering issue of slavery, the fact that the institution of slavery had separated the North from the South so differently, both culturally and economically, meant that it was constantly keeping the United States as a much more kind of divided nation. And after the Civil War, you know, you really kind of look at the power dynamics in the South ultimately don't change a whole lot. And we're going to look at that more going into next week, looking at the Reconstruction time period, where despite kind of this large war that we ultimately had, the same people are going to be in charge after the Civil War in the South that were before it. The institution of slavery itself is going to be gone, but they find other ways to maintain their wealth and their power and their station within society. But the country as a whole starts looking much more similar in the aspects of industrialization and the aspects of unity, and that after the Civil War, you start seeing the United States operating much more as kind of a cohesive unit than sort of one unit with two brains or two minds, so to speak, as it seemed like every issue came down to the division between the northern states and the southern states prior to the Civil War. Now, going after the Civil War, you start seeing more clarity and kind of thinking in one mind, so to speak, moving forward. Of course, some historians might disagree with that interpretation and might say that you know, just because the North was able to win the war, they sort of forced that unification onto the South and so forth, which might not be entirely without merit. But you know, looking at the end results, you know, the United States and the country that was ultimately going to become through the process of kind of its transition to imperialism, to its run up to the First World War, the increase in immigration you ultimately see happening with the new immigration waves, all of this is really sort of triggered, as well as the expansion to kind of complete the you know, transcontinental occupation of the United States and taking the rest of the land from American Indian tribes. All this is kind of hinged and dependent upon the United States being unified coming out of the Civil War time period. And it was difficult to see, you know, the United States taking a similar path if it was going to be remained divided by the issues that had divided it up into the Civil War going into the 20th century. So I think you can, if you want to come back and take, you know, the second portion of this class, you'll start seeing how a lot of this ends up playing out over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years after the Civil War, and how the United States ultimately does end up looking much more like a kind of unified nation than it does going into it. And I think this also has to do with the question of nationalism I was talking about in the previous question, and which we kind of touched upon in the document exercise as well. So speaking of the document exercise, I want to go ahead and take a look at that. So looking at Lincoln reaching into America's past throughout his address, certainly the very first sentence here of 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So, of course, he is referencing here directly the Declaration of Independence and saying this is really when our country or when our nation started. And this kind of bleeds into question number 2, but why does he choose the Declaration of Independence? Of course, the Declaration of Independence is where kind of that American creed is formed, right? That all men are created equal and endowed with these inalienable rights. He pretty much says as much in his opening paragraph here, and that is really the justification now that he is pretty much using for the war, for the conflict. It has come down to this idea of slavery, and that if you remember from the video, his quote that America cannot, long sustain itself as, half free and half slave, and really kind of articulating that here in the Gettysburg Address in a very simple but a very eloquent way. Of course, in the Constitution, you see the introduction of slavery pretty much being written into the American government. The 3/5 clause with the Fugitive Slave Act. All of these things pretty much make slavery the law of the land. So that is why Abraham Lincoln is directly going back to kind of what he certainly felt was the American creed and the core of American values, this idea of liberty for all men, of course, at this point still. They've not gotten a society to the point where they wanted to grant women equal rights yet. But the fact that that is where he is going back to and hearkening back to, rather than the Constitution, which saw, of course, slavery being part of this, and where that was really a chance for the United States to, settle this issue of slavery before it became such a divisive issue, and they were unable to do so. So going back to kind of the original ideas rather than the actual laws that the United States had been operating under. He also goes back, to a number of other times throughout the document, referencing kind of that kind of time period and the ideals that the nation was created under. Of course, referencing the Battle of Gettysburg itself, which at this point in time happened just a few months prior, in the summer of 1863. So that given in 1863 the country was still engaged in a civil war, how does Lincoln refer to the war? What tone, emotions, feeling does he use when discussing the conflict? And I thought a lot of you did a really good job pointing this out during the document exercise, is that, Abraham Lincoln is certainly, he's not gloating here, right? This isn't like a rah-rah victory speech. This is a much more kind of humbled speech, and a speech that has a much more somber tone than one might expect following kind of the greatest Union victory up until this point in the war. And I mean, I would go even farther and say, if you took out this one line here where he says we are now engaged in this great civil war, if you took that out and just said we are now engaged in this great war, I think it would be relatively difficult to even tell he was referring to the Civil War here if you didn't know that's what it was about. This could have been about, the war of the United States or this nation against any nation, right? And that he really does not make any kind of differentiation between Northern and Southern soldiers, and that if you didn't know the circumstances surrounding it, just reading this, you wouldn't not even recognize kind of the conflict that they were in. And that's kind of the tone that he sets, and I think that really why he chooses this tone and that way of writing about it, and kind of commemorating the event and the sacrifice rather than the victory for one side over the other, comes down to kind of our second couple questions here. So looking at the definitions of nationalism, could you define the Gettysburg Address as a nationalistic speech? Some people had some trouble identifying this, whereas other people were more willing to say, yeah, I can see that. Certainly at various places speaking very highly of the United States, talking about how the world will not notice these words, but it's never going to forget their deeds. Much more important for the United States than necessarily the rest of the world at this point in time, as well as obviously talking about one nation conceived by God with the birth of liberty and freedom and going forward. Certainly a little bit of self-glossing at that point, but more than anything, I would say the very fact that he does not make these separations between the North and the South, and he is really aiming this address at all Americans, regardless of what side of the battle or the war they fought on, I think is very nationalistic in and of itself. And if you look at Abraham Lincoln and his kind of goals throughout the war, his goal was always to preserve the Union. And of course, slavery played a large part into that and was one of the things he was able to really utilize, and really one of the things I think he personally felt was important. was limiting at least and eventually eradicating the institution of slavery. But more than anything, he wanted to keep the country as a whole and keep the nation as a whole and bring it back together again. And looking at question number 5 from our PowerPoint questions, this kind of bleeds into that as well, right? This idea that the United States ultimately, in large part thanks to Lincoln, following coming out of the Civil War, is a much more unified country than it was going in, particularly because it did go through this long period. So what vision does Lincoln have for America going forward? Once more, going back to the tone of it, I think you can really kind of see this as the first example of Lincoln trying to be very reconciliatory towards the South, right? He's trying to, like I said, not gloat it over them, not hang it over their head, and try to be very somber and reflective about this. And this really, influences or is, I'd say, evidence of his attitude towards the South in general, that he wants to, after the war, integrate them back into the country as quickly as he can, while making sure that kind of the rebellious aspects that led to their separation was not going to crop up and rear its head again, right? But if you look at the terms that Grant ultimately offers at the surrender and the plan that Abraham Lincoln had in place, it was much more based around forgiveness and reintegration than it was punishment. The goal wasn't to punish the South for seceding, it was to try to reintegrate them into the country as quickly as possible. Now, of course, there's lots of Republicans in Congress who have a very different view of what they think the Reconstruction time period should be. And once Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and there's a much different precedent in Johnson who takes over, you start seeing those very different views start cropping up. But I think looking at the Gettysburg Address is a really good way to see that his main goal and his main focus was always a reunification of the country and a reconciliation of the two sides moving forward. All right, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you.